Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking about everybody's favorite topic. Every first-time visitor, every 10th-time visitor, 20th-time visitor, people who've only seen the movie, they love to talk about today's topic, which is, of course, the 20th Maine. And our guest today is a fellow who's been on the show before. You'll recall him from fall of 2022. What year is this? Yeah, so 2022, we talked about the Gettysburg Address, and he's back today to talk about a book that is not out yet, but he's working on, about the 20th Maine. What's the name of do you have a name for the book yet?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm tentatively going with Dura Joe's Sons. That's the Maine state motto. It stands for I Lead.
Okay.
But I don't know. I think it's 50-50 that ends up being it. It could well be something else if I find something better.
I think you should just call it Swinging Door.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I like it.
No, it's not good. This is Jared Peatman, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you.
So, okay. First of all, what made you want to write a book about the 20th Maine?
Well, I grew up in Maine.
That helps.
Yeah, that helps. And I became interested in history from a very young age. And then we sort of moved through the eras, colonial history, revolutionary history. We got to the Civil War. And my parents, my mom in particular, was great about bringing me on all these field trips. And we got to the Civil War, and she said, you have to stop because I can't take you to the World War I battlefield. So I get stuck on the Civil War. And, pretty quickly, somebody gave me a copy of John Pullen's iconic 1957 History of the 20th Maine. And I was hooked. So from the time I was about 13 or so, I started collecting every account I could find for the 20th Maine. And what I was really putting together were all the accounts from June and July of 1863. So a month before through a month after the battle, and all the diaries, all the letters home. And it was just really fascinating to see how, 5-6 men writing about the same event, whether it's a huge thing like the battle or a smaller thing, just like their march through Frederick, how they talked about it differently and the details different ones added. So it goes back quite a while for me at this point.
But now the 20th Maine, that means it's the 20th regiment from Maine. I believe there were more.
Mm-hmm.
Why does everybody in Maine love the 20th of Maine?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, why does everybody love Gettysburg? And some people would say it's because of the Gettysburg Address. And maybe it's somewhat the same with the 20th Maine. Maybe it's because everybody loves Chamberlain.
Yeah.
And it's a great, the 20th Maine has a great story. The 16th Maine has a great story as well.
There's plenty that have a great story.
Yeah, there's a lot that do. But I think there's something about that idea of a non-military man, maybe one of us, we'd like to think, right, that's commanding this unit in this pivotal moment. And you look and you think, maybe I could have been that person.
I think that's the lore of the Civil War in general, even the Revolution, and I'm sure others, but those are the two big ones that people care about. That anyone can rise up to be a leader of men.
Yeah.
And that's a very American ideal.
Yeah, I think so. And again, just this idea that they're, just these citizens. But why the 20th Maine? Maybe it's John Pullen too. That book in 1957, John Pullen and Alan Nolan, writing Pullen, the book on the 20th Maine, Alan Nolan, the book on the Iron Brigade that came out, I think just a couple years after that. They restart unit histories. So they're the first unit histories that had been written by men who weren't members of the unit. And so you see reminiscences written in the 1880s to early 1900s by men that were in the units. But this idea that you would have unit histories, these two really started. And it flourishes for a while in the aftermath of that. And John Pullen's 20th Maine is one of the best Civil War books ever written. And so I think he has to have some credit, too, as to why there's been this fascination. In fact, Michael Shara, is hugely influential, right? The author of Killer Angels, that the movie Gettysburg is based on. I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it said that Michael Shara only read a handful of books to prepare for writing The Killer Angels, and John Pullen's The 20th Maine was one of them. And so if Gettysburg, the movie, The Killer Angels, is part of why we are so fascinated with Joshua Chamberlain and The 20th Maine, you could maybe trace it to Shara, you could maybe trace it back to Pullen, in that way.
Certainly, though, it all has to begin with Chamberlain and his way of writing, his prominence after the war, even by the end of the war, but like, you know, he became a very prominent person, and he was a great writer.
He is.
And people wanted to listen to him speak or read his writings. And so that makes sense that he would have been the guy that started it and just was able to capture the imagination of Mainers and Americans alike. Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So let's get into, first of all, your book. You were explaining to me before we started, kind of like the outline of your book, what each chapter deals with. Just give the listeners a taste so that when it comes out, they'll jump and buy it.
Yeah, so I decided to structure the book not around a straight-up narrative of this happened and then that happened. I had a professor in grad school that said, you know, the worst history books are the ones that just talk about one damn thing after another, right? So instead, to take sort of an argument-based approach. And so chapter 1 is essentially the background of the regiment, enlisting, and then that first 10 months of the war up until Gettysburg. And the central question I wanted to answer there, you know, we know at Gettysburg they made this bayonet charge. They did all these really tough things to do in what was really only their second battle. You know, they played a small role at Fredericksburg, but that's it. And so the question I wanted to answer was, how did they do that? How did they turn into this really highly functional unit? So I looked at the training and the bonding and all of those types of experiences. In chapter 2, I kind of did the same thing, but for Chamberlain. How did this college professor get to the point where he could command men to do those things? And so that one I called the professor's education. Chapter 3 is on those pesky mutineers who, to be honest with you, I think the movie Gettysburg and Killer Angels actually gets closer to the truth than almost any of the nonfiction books that are out there.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know that anybody previously has said anything that is incorrect about the mutineers. It's just that there's so much more to the story.
I know that the movie and the book, I think both, but I know the movie at least gets the timeline a little off.
But yeah, the timeline's a little off. So, you know, Hollywood movies compress time and space, you know, which I think is fine.
Of course.
But
the fact of the matter is they still had to take on these mutineers.
Yeah. So the reality is, you know, that this incident started to unfold about 6 weeks before the battle, not the night before the battle.
Right.
And so which makes it a lot more nuanced process to sort of play out. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is about the battle. 72 pages, the rough draft. So I may have to work on cutting that a little bit. Let's see. And then chapter 5 is post-war adjustments to coming home. This is something people didn't write about before Vietnam. It's something that there have been several good books lately. But what I'm interested in doing is I've built sort of a database, a composite of every man who was on Little Round Top, all 505-ish of them that were on Little Round Top, and then looking at how long did they live? Where did they die? You know, did they move after the war? What happened to their fortunes? What happened to their health as revealed by the pension records? To be able to say some really comprehensive things and not just cherry pick a few cool stories here. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, I am going to cherry pick a few cool stories to illustrate that too.
Sure,
yeah, you know, so there's about a dozen men that I'm going to profile at some length in that chapter to talk about their experiences. And then the last chapter, 5th chapter, is that same era post-war, but it's looking at the commemorative activities. It's looking at some of the controversies that arose between some of the men as well in the aftermath, what really happened, you know, those types of things. And then up to the present to an extent, you know, the impact of the movie, and even through 2019, you know, the ghost of Paul Revere wrote that great ballad of the 20th Maine, which is now the official Maine state ballad. So, you know, looking at all of those types of things.
So you said the 505 on top of Little Round Top. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where I get this. I could just have mistaken this, but I always thought they had around like 350 or something like that. Where do you get 505?
Well, you get 350 because you read the monument. And the monument says 358 enlisted men and 28 officers. So 386 is the traditional kind of number that's been cited. But in 1898, the state of Maine, as many states did, published a book called Maine at Gettysburg, and it's pretty thick. It's maybe 3-4 inches thick.
I have it. I think it's
reprinted by Stan Clark a few years ago.
Yeah.
And you can find originals as well. Anyway, so history of the unit in the battle, but roster as well. And the way they compiled this roster for the 20th Maine anyway, Lincoln County newspaper was published by Samuel Miller, who had been a member of the unit. So they publish a preliminary roster of who they think was on Little Round Top. And then they encourage men to write in and say, you forgot about me. Oh. Or they encourage other men to say, you put him on there, but he was our shirker and he wasn't actually there. So there's all this correspondence.
Okay.
And so the official published list in the end is just over 500 names. I'm working on I have a philosophical question here because you have a lot of non-combatants who are on Little Round Top. So you have the chaplain, Luther French. Does he count? Does he not count? You have hospital stewards. Do they count? Do they not?
Was his brother John? Wasn't he there too?
Yeah. So,
but was he on the hill or was he behind the lines?
Yeah. So John Chamberlain is a volunteer with the Christian Commission who has come down to assist, and he's helping out in part because the 20th Maine is actually in between surgeons. Not a great time to be in between surgeons.
No.
But they're in between surgeons at the battle, and so he's helping at an aid station that is further behind the lines. Okay. I don't think he's up on Little Round Top. His diary, he talks about taking leave of them as they're heading into the wheat field and going to an aid station that's further back.
Okay.
But yeah, he's an example, but he's clearly a civilian. There are men who are in the unit but are not carrying a gun. Do they count? Do they not count? That's an interesting thing.
Well, I mean, if you're counting people on Little Round Top, then I guess they count.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess if you want to count combatants or everybody,
and then you have a few famously who portray themselves as being there that weren't. So the first. Sort of history of the unit by a man who was in the unit, Theodore Garish, a book that came out in 1882, Army Life, which is fantastic. Gettysburg chapter is all in the third person. And so about 20 years ago, people started to ask why. Turns out he was sick in the hospital during Gettysburg. But it's interesting. He shows up in Maine at Gettysburg as having been there. He's a pretty prominent reverend in the aftermath of the war. And so there's a little bit of politics there, who gets on that list and who doesn't as well.
Okay.
So, it's like everything. You can't quite take it at face value.
So it's round about 500.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So how about the background then? 20th Maine is not a regiment that starts at the beginning of the war, correct?
Right. So in the summer of 1862, the Peninsula Campaign goes very, very badly for the Union. George McClellan's attempt to take Richmond, kind of by the back door, and just huge casualties. They had closed the recruiting offices in the North in the spring of 62. They thought they didn't need any more men. In fact, there were men in Maine that had enlisted or volunteered, and they turned them away. They told them to go home. They didn't need any more. They realized that's not going to be the case. So July 2nd, the government calls for 300,000 more men. July 4th, the governor of Maine, Israel Washburn, calls for 4 more regiments, actually 3 regiments initially to form. The 16th Maine was already forming, but then also the 17th, 18th, and 19th Maine. And they get so many men, ultimately, that they
form the 20th.
Oh,
yeah. Okay.
So one of the interesting things about the 20th, and I'll admit my bias right from the start, I don't think he's perfect in any way. But I think Chamberlain has gotten a bit of a bad rap in the recent years. And I think part of the reason is he became so popular, as you said at the beginning, that a lot of people just got annoyed with how focused every tourist is on Chamberlain.
Yes.
One of the reasons that Chamberlain writes as much as he does is because the 20th Maine is not geographically located in any particular place in Maine. There's no hometown newspaper that's taken up their cause that is writing about them. In fact, Chamberlain is writing to the governor throughout early 1863 saying, we're being ignored. Officers aren't getting promoted because there's nobody kind of pleading their case back in Maine. They feel like an orphan regiment. And so...
Because they were the leftovers, right?
Yeah, because they literally are from every part. They're from every county of Maine.
Right, okay.
Every county of Maine. The second Maine, we know famously got incorporated in part into them. They're all really clustered around Bangor. So they're from this tight little area. The Bangor Whig and Courier is writing about them all the time. 20th Maine is rarely referenced in the newspapers back in Maine. And so Chamberlain in part's trying to make up for that, not necessarily to overly glorify them, but just to get them what he thinks are their just desserts at times.
Right.
That's a little bit of what's going on here, is this geographic disbursement.
So they get mustered into service and everything like that. Who's their first commander?
Yeah, their first commander is a 26-year-old named Adelbert Ames, who had graduated from West Point. Graduated from West Point at a time when West Point actually had a 5-year curriculum, not a 4-year curriculum. Okay. West Point in those days, if you attended West Point, if you look at the curriculum, you'll spend a lot of time on military theory in the classroom. but they drill for 4 hours a night. So in the years that Ames is at West Point, he has over 1,500 hours of drill in small unit tactics and maneuvers. So he becomes their captain, their colonel. He is the son of a ship captain. So as a younger man, before he had gone off to West Point, he sailed the world. He's seen the world. Kind of an interesting perspective he might have. He served in an artillery unit at the beginning of the war. He's wounded at the Battle of Bull Run. Later, he'll be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions there, and he's fought very well.
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it, support the show, and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.